The king who vanished. The kingdom of Valdris had been silent for 300 years. Not the peaceful silence of sleeping villages or the gentle quiet of snowfall on empty fields. This was a different kind of silence, heavy, unnatural, the kind that pressed against your chest and made you forget how to breathe. The kind that told you something was very, very wrong, even if you couldn't see it. The mountains that surrounded Valdris stood like ancient guardians, their peaks wrapped in mist that never quite lifted, their shadows stretching long across valleys where no travelers dared to walk. The forests at their base had grown wild and thick, swallowing old roads and forgotten pathways as if the land itself was trying to hide something. And at the heart of it all, rising from the highest cliff like a wound against the gray sky, stood Castle Morvane. Its towers were black against the clouds. Its windows were dark, had been dark for centuries, and the villagers who lived in the distant lowlands told their children never to look too long at that silhouette on the horizon. They said that something lived there still, something that had once been a king, something that had once been loved, something that had chosen to lock itself away from the world rather than face what it had become. They called him the Vampire King, but they had forgotten his real name. His name was Kael Morvane, and he had been 27 years old when he died the first death, the human death, the one that took his heartbeat and his warmth and his reflection in mirrors. He had been 31 when he died the second death, the death of his hope, the death of his belief that he could still be good. And he had been watching the centuries pass from the window of his empty throne room ever since, counting the years in silence, waiting for something he couldn't name. Tonight, the snow was falling. Kael stood at the window of the highest tower, his pale fingers resting against the frozen glass, his dark eyes watching the flakes drift down through the darkness. He didn't feel the cold, hadn't felt it in 300 years, but he remembered what it was like. He remembered being a boy, running through the castle courtyard with his younger sister, catching snowflakes on his tongue and laughing when they melted. He remembered his mother wrapping a wool scarf around his neck, her hands warm, her smile soft, her voice telling him to come inside before he caught his death. But before he caught his death, the memory was a knife in his chest. He closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the glass, and for a long moment he let himself feel the weight of all those years. The weight of every sunrise he had watched from the shadows, the weight of every voice he had heard in the distance, knowing he could never answer. The weight of every time he had felt the hunger rise inside him, dark and terrible and impossible to ignore, and had locked himself in the deepest dungeon of the castle until it passed. He was not a monster, but he was afraid he could become one. That was the truth that no one knew, not the villagers who whispered about him, not the hunters who had tried to find him over the centuries, not even the other vampires who had sought him out in the early years, drawn by rumors of his power, hoping to make him their leader, their weapon, their king of darkness. He had sent them all away. He had sent everyone away. Because Kael Morvane had discovered something about himself in the first decade after his turning, something that had filled him with a terror so profound that he had made a choice no vampire had ever made before. He had chosen isolation. He had chosen silence. He had chosen to become a ghost in his own castle rather than risk what might happen if he ever lost control. His power was not like other vampires' power. When he fed, truly fed, not the careful sips of animal blood that he allowed himself to survive, something happened to him. Something awakened. His eyes turned from dark brown to burning silver. His strength multiplied beyond anything he could comprehend. And worst of all, his mind changed. He could feel it happening, feel the humanity draining out of him like water through a cracked cup, feel something ancient and hungry and utterly without mercy taking its place. He had only lost control once. It had been 287 years ago in a village at the base of the mountains. There had been a fire, an accident, a fallen lantern in a stable, and people had been trapped. Kael had heard their screams from miles away, had felt something in his chest that he later realized was the last remnant of his human heart responding to suffering. He had gone to help. He had pulled people from the flames with his bare hands, had carried children to safety, had moved faster than the eye could follow. And then one of the villagers had cut himself on broken glass. The blood had hit the air, and Kael had felt the hunger surge up from somewhere deep inside him, a hunger that was not just physical but spiritual, a hunger that wanted to consume not just blood but life, soul, everything. He had fought it. He had fought it with every ounce of will he possessed. But for one terrible moment, his eyes had turned silver, and he had felt his fangs extend, and he had taken a single step toward the injured man with a look on his face that had made everyone around him scream. He had stopped himself. He didn't know how, but he had stopped himself. He had turned and fled into the darkness, running until the castle walls were around him again, running until he could lock himself in the dungeon and let the hunger slowly, agonizingly fade. No one had been hurt, but Kael had seen the fear in their eyes. He had seen the way they looked at him in that single moment when the monster had almost broken through. And he had understood with a clarity that still haunted him that his power was too great, that his hunger was too deep, that no matter how hard he tried to be good, there would always be that darkness waiting inside him, patient and terrible, ready to consume him the moment he let his guard down. So he had made his choice. He had walked back to Castle Morvane, and he had closed the gates, and he had never left again. 300 years of silence. 300 years of watching the world from windows. 300 years of being alone with the monster inside him, fighting it every day, winning every day, but never knowing if tomorrow would be the day he finally lost. The snow was falling harder now. Kael opened his eyes and looked out at the white landscape, at the trees bending under the weight of the storm, at the paths that had long since disappeared under drifts of snow that no one would ever walk through. He wondered, as he often did, if this was what he deserved. He wondered if the loneliness was a punishment or a protection. He wondered if there was any difference anymore. Oh, and then he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind. The castle was old, and the wind often found its way through cracks in the stone, creating sounds that could almost be mistaken for voices. Kael had learned to ignore them over the centuries, had learned to tune out the whispers and the moans and the sighs that the old building made in the darkness. But this was different. This was a voice, a real voice, a human voice. And it was singing. Kael went completely still. The song was faint, carried on the wind from somewhere far below, somewhere in the forest at the base of the mountain. It was a simple melody, the kind that mothers sang to children, the kind that had no words he could make out, just a gentle rise and fall of notes that seemed to hang in the cold air like something fragile and precious. He hadn't heard a human voice in almost a century. The last one had been a hunter who had gotten lost in the mountains and had stumbled too close to the castle. Kael had watched him from the shadows, had made sure the man found his way back to the path, had never let himself be seen. The hunter had survived, had returned to his village with stories of strange lights in the castle windows, and Kael had added another layer to his isolation, another wall between himself and the world. But this voice was not lost. This voice was deliberate. Someone was walking toward the castle. Someone was walking through the storm, through the snow, through the darkness, and they were singing as they walked, not in fear, not in desperation, just singing, as if the journey was long and the song was keeping them company. Kael moved without thinking. He was down the tower stairs before he even made the decision to go, his feet carrying him through the empty hallways of the castle, past the covered furniture and the dusty portraits and the chandeliers that had once blazed with 1,000 candles but now hung dark and silent. He reached the main hall, with its enormous fireplace that hadn't been lit in centuries and its throne that he had never once sat in since his turning. He passed through the entrance chamber, with its great iron doors that were rusted shut, sealed by time and his own deliberate neglect. He couldn't go outside. He had promised himself that. He had sworn it on what remained of his humanity. The outside world was too dangerous not for him but because of him. If he left the castle, he might encounter people. If he encountered people, he might feel the hunger. If he felt the hunger, he might lose control. And if he lost control. But the voice was getting closer. Kael pressed his hands against the iron doors and closed his eyes, and he listened. The song was clearer now. He could hear the words, fragments of them at least, in a language he didn't recognize, something old and soft and strangely beautiful. And beneath the song he could hear other things, footsteps crunching in the snow, a heartbeat strong and steady and alive, breathing that was slightly labored from the climb. Whoever was out there was real, and they were coming to him. Why? The question burned in his mind. No one came to Castle Morvane. The villagers knew better. The hunters had stopped trying decades ago. Even the other vampires had given up on him, had decided that the legendary Kael Morvane was either dead or too broken to be of use. The world had forgotten him, and he had been grateful for it. So who was this? The singing stopped. Kael held his breath, a habit from his human life that had never quite left him, and waited. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the snow and the old castle settling around him. Then, from just outside the iron doors, he heard a voice speak. I know you're there. It was a woman's voice, young but not a child, clear but with a slight tremor that might have been cold or might have been fear. And there was something else in it, something that Kael couldn't quite identify, a quality that made him want to lean closer, to hear more, to let her keep talking forever. I know you can hear me, she continued. I've been walking for 3 days to find you, my village, my family. They said you were a legend, a story to scare children. But I knew you were real, I could feel it. I've always been able to feel things that others couldn't, and I felt you up here in the darkness, alone for so long that the loneliness has become its own kind of silence. Mikhail's hands trembled against the iron doors. No one had ever spoken to him like this. No one had ever spoken about him like this, not as a monster to be feared or a weapon to be used, but as something to be found, something to be reached, something that was suffering in a way that mattered. My name is Alina, the woman said, and I need your help. My village is dying. There's a sickness, something none of our healers can cure, something that came from the old mines in the eastern hills. My mother is sick, my little brother. Everyone I love is fading, and the doctors say there's nothing that can save them. A pause, the wind howled, and then Alina's voice came again, quieter now but somehow more powerful. But there are stories, old stories from before you locked yourself away, stories about a vampire who could heal with his blood, who saved a village from plague 300 years ago by walking through the streets and touching the sick and taking their illness into himself. They say you stopped when you realized how dangerous your power was. They say you chose to disappear rather than risk becoming the thing you were afraid of. Mikhail felt something crack inside his chest. He remembered that night. He remembered the plague village. He remembered the faces of the children he had healed, the tears of the mothers who had thanked him, the way his own blood had burned as it took their sickness and transformed it into something his immortal body could destroy. He remembered feeling, for one brief and beautiful moment, that maybe his curse was not just a curse, that maybe there was a purpose to his existence, a way he could use what he had become to help instead of harm. And he remembered what had happened afterward. He remembered the hunger that had followed the healing, deeper and more terrible than anything he had ever felt. He remembered the way his eyes had turned silver and stayed silver for 3 days. He remembered locking himself in the deepest part of the castle and screaming until his throat was raw, fighting the thing inside him that wanted to go back to that village and take back everything he had given, to drain every life he had saved until there was nothing left. Well, he had won that fight, but barely. And he had never healed anyone again. I'm not asking you to come with me, Alina said. I'm not asking you to leave your castle or face your fears or be anything you're not ready to be. I'm just asking for a chance, one small chance, a vial of your blood, that's all, just enough to save my mother, just enough to save my brother, just enough to give me something to bring back to my village so that everyone I love doesn't die while I watch. Her voice broke on the last words. And Kael felt something he hadn't felt in centuries. He felt his heart, his cold, silent, dead heart, ache. He pressed his forehead against the iron doors and closed his eyes, and for a long moment he let himself feel the weight of her plea. He thought about his own mother, dead for 3 centuries, buried in a grave he had never visited because he couldn't bear to see her name carved in stone. He thought about his sister, who had lived to old age and died surrounded by grandchildren, who had never known what happened to her brother, who had probably believed the stories that said he had been killed by the same creature that had turned him. He thought about all the people he could have saved over the centuries, all the plagues and famines and disasters that had swept through the world while he sat in his empty castle and watched from the windows. He thought about the monster inside him, patient and waiting, always waiting. And he thought about the woman on the other side of the door, who had walked for 3 days through a winter storm, who had sung to keep herself company in the darkness, who had come to him not with weapons or demands, but with a simple, desperate hope. Please, Alina whispered. I know you're afraid, I can feel it, but I'm afraid too, and sometimes being afraid together is better than being afraid alone. Kael opened his eyes. His hands were still pressed against the iron doors, and he could feel the cold of the metal through his skin, could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him, could feel the monster inside him stirring at the sound of that heartbeat, that warm and living heartbeat just on the other side of the barrier. Well, he should tell her to leave. He should stay silent and let her think he wasn't there, let her give up and go home, let her find another way to save her village. He should protect her from himself, the way he had protected the world from himself for 300 years. But her voice had done something to him. It had reached through the walls and the silence and the centuries of isolation, and it had touched something that he thought had died a long time ago. It had reminded him of what it felt like to be needed, what it felt like to be seen, what it felt like to be something other than a monster hiding in the dark. Oh, he couldn't give her his blood. He knew that the risk was too great. If he opened those doors, if he let himself be near a human, if he smelled her blood and felt her warmth and heard her heartbeat up close, the hunger might rise, the monster might wake. And this time, after 300 years of building strength in the darkness, it might be too powerful to stop. But he couldn't let her walk away either. Not like this, not without knowing that someone had heard her, that someone cared, that her 3-day journey through the storm had not been for nothing. Kael took a deep breath, another human habit, useless for his dead lungs but comforting nonetheless, and he placed his palm flat against the iron door. The metal was old and rusted, sealed by time, impossible to open without breaking it down completely, but his voice could still carry through the cracks. Go home, Elena. The words came out rough and broken, unused for so long that they barely sounded like language. He heard her gasp on the other side of the door, heard her heart rate spike with a mixture of fear and hope and something else he couldn't name. You're real, she breathed. You're actually real. I am what the stories say I am, Kael said. A monster, a creature of darkness, the thing that parents warn their children about, and I cannot help you. Oh, but I cannot help you, he repeated, and his voice cracked on the words. Not because I don't want to, not because I don't care, but because helping you would require me to open these doors, and if I open these doors, if I let myself be near you, I might not be able to stop what happens next. A silence. The wind howled around the castle, driving snow against the walls, filling the air with a sound like distant screaming. Kael waited, his hand still pressed against the iron, his dead heart aching with a pain he thought he had forgotten how to feel. And then Alina spoke again. I understand, she said. Her voice was quiet but steady, all the trembling gone. You're afraid you'll hurt me. You're afraid that the hunger inside you is stronger than the person you want to be. You've been fighting that battle for 300 years, and you're tired and you're lonely, and you've convinced yourself that the only way to keep the world safe is to keep yourself locked away forever. Kael's eyes widened. But here's what I think, Alina continued. I think you're wrong. I think the monster you're so afraid of isn't as strong as you believe it is. I think the fact that you've been fighting for 300 years proves that you're stronger than you know. And I think that the loneliness is killing you just as surely as the sickness is killing my family, just slower and quieter and with no one to witness it. Her words hit him like physical blows. I'm not leaving, Alina said. Not tonight, it's too cold and too dark to walk back down the mountain, so I'm going to sit here outside your door and I'm going to wait. And while I'm waiting, I'm going to sing. Because singing is what my mother taught me to do when I was afraid, and I am afraid right now, more afraid than I've ever been in my life. But I'm also hopeful, because I believe in you, Kael Morvane. I believe that somewhere behind those doors is a man who remembers what it means to be human. And I believe that if I wait long enough, he might remember that he wants to be found. Oh, she knew his name. The realization sent a shock through him. She knew his name, his real name, the name that hadn't been spoken aloud in 3 centuries, the name that the world had forgotten along with everything else about who he used to be. How he started. But Alina was already singing. The melody drifted through the cracks in the iron door, the same song she had been singing as she walked through the storm, but clearer now, closer, more beautiful than anything Kael had heard in 300 years. It was a lullaby, he realized, a mother's song for a frightened child. And as he listened, as the notes wrapped around him and filled the empty spaces in his soul, he felt something he had never expected to feel again. Well, he felt tears on his face. Vampires couldn't cry, or so he had believed. Their bodies were dead, their emotions dulled by centuries of existence, their connection to humanity severed by the curse that had transformed them. But as Alina's voice rose and fell in the darkness, Kael felt something warm and wet sliding down his cold cheeks, and he realized that he had been wrong. He could still cry. He could still feel. He was still, in some small and fragile way, human. And as the night grew darker and the snow fell harder and Alina's voice continued to drift through the cracks in the door, Kael Morvane made a decision that would change everything for himself, for her, and for a world that had forgotten what miracles looked like. He didn't open the door. No, not yet. But for the first time in 300 years, he didn't walk away either. He sat down on the cold stone floor, his back against the iron, his eyes closed, his dead heart somehow beating in rhythm with the song. And he listened. He listened until the singing finally faded into silence, until he heard Alina's breathing slow and deepen, until he realized that she had fallen asleep outside his door, trusting him enough to be vulnerable, believing in him enough to stay. He should wake her, he should send her away. He should do something, anything, to protect her from what he was. But instead, he reached out with his pale hand and pressed his palm against the crack in the door, and he felt, just barely, the warmth of her breath drifting through. She was alive. She was real. And she had come to him not as a hunter or a conqueror, but as a person in need of help, believing that he was still capable of giving it. Well, the monster inside him stirred. But for the first time in 300 years, something else stirred too, something older and stronger and infinitely more dangerous to the darkness that had made its home in his soul. A hope. Kael didn't sleep that night. He sat with his back against the door, his hand pressed to the cold iron, and he listened to Alina breathe. He counted each inhale and exhale, memorized the rhythm, let it become a kind of anchor in the vast ocean of his solitude. And as the hours passed and the storm slowly quieted and the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the mountains, he asked himself a question he had been avoiding for 3 centuries. What if she's right? What if the monster wasn't as strong as he believed? What if the loneliness really was killing him? What if the walls he had built to protect the world were actually destroying the very thing he was trying to save, not the world, but himself? Well, he didn't have an answer. But for the first time in 300 years, he wanted to find one. The sun rose behind the clouds, pale and distant, its light filtering through the storm-gray sky. Kael felt the familiar pull of daylight fatigue, not the burning that legends described, but a deep exhaustion that made his limbs heavy and his thoughts slow. He should retreat to the inner chambers, away from the windows, away from the light. But he didn't move. He stayed where he was, his back against the door, his hand still pressed to the iron, and he waited for Alina to wake up. When she did, her voice came through the door, sleepy and surprised. "You're still there." "Oh, yes." A pause. "I didn't think you would be." "Well, neither did I." Another pause, longer this time. And then Alina laughed, a small, tired, wonderful sound that made something inside Kael's chest expand in a way that was almost painful. "I must look terrible," she said. "Sleeping in the snow outside a vampire's castle, my mother would be horrified." "Your mother," Kael said slowly, "is the reason you came." "Oh, yes. Tell me about her." He didn't know why he asked. He didn't know why it mattered. But Alina's voice had become something he couldn't bear to lose, and he wanted to hear more of it, wanted to understand who this woman was, this impossible person who had walked through a storm to find a monster and had stayed to sing him lullabies. So Alina told him. She told him about her mother's garden, which bloomed with flowers that shouldn't have survived the mountain winters but somehow did. She told him about her mother's hands, which were always warm, and her mother's laugh, which sounded like bells. She told him about the way her mother had held her when she was sick as a child, had sung to her through the fever, had promised her that everything would be all right even when they both knew it might not be. And she told him about the sickness. It had started 3 months ago in the eastern mines where the men of the village worked. A strange dust had begun rising from the deeper tunnels, dust that sparkled in the lamplight and tasted like copper on the tongue. The miners had breathed it in day after day, and one by one they had started to cough, then to bleed, then to fade. Alina's father had been one of the first to die. Her mother had caught it from caring for him, her brother from sleeping in the same bed. Now half the village was sick, and the healthy half was slowly following, and no doctor or healer or priest had been able to stop it. The old stories say your blood can heal anything, Alina said. That it carries the power of centuries, the strength of 100 lifetimes. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if you can really save them. But I had to try. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and watch everyone I love die. Her voice broke, and Kael felt the monster inside him go completely, utterly still. It wasn't hunger that filled him now. It wasn't the darkness or the terrible craving or the fear of what he might become. It was something else, something he had almost forgotten he could feel. It was rage. Not at Alina, not at the villagers, but at the world itself, at the cruel randomness of disease and death, at the injustice of innocent people suffering while he sat in his castle doing nothing, pretending that his isolation was noble when really it was just fear wearing a different mask. He had power. He had the ability to save them. And he had been hiding for 300 years because he was afraid of himself. But Elena wasn't afraid. She had walked through a storm. She had slept outside a vampire's door. She had told him her mother's secrets and her father's death and her desperate, burning hope for a miracle. She had seen him for what he was, or at least for what he might be, and she had refused to run. If she could be that brave, then maybe. Maybe he could be brave too. Lilina. Oh, yes. Kael closed his eyes. The monster stirred again, somewhere deep in the darkness of his soul, but it felt distant now, not gone, but manageable, controllable, like a fire that could be contained if he was careful enough. I need you to do something for me, he said. Anything. I need you to step back from the door, as far as you can go, and I need you to stay there no matter what happens until I tell you it's safe. A silence. Then, softly, you're going to open it. Oh, yes. You're going to help me. I'm going to try. He heard her footsteps crunching in the snow, heard her heartbeat fading slightly as she moved away. 10 feet, 20, 30. She stopped at the edge of the courtyard, far enough that he could barely make out the rhythm of her pulse. Far enough, he hoped, to be safe if he lost control. Kael stood. His body felt strange, weak, and strong at the same time, ancient and young, dead and somehow more alive than it had been in centuries. He placed both hands on the iron doors, felt the rust and the weight and the centuries of isolation pressing back against him. And then, with a sound like the world breaking open, he pushed. The doors groaned, the hinges screamed. Rust fell in great red flakes, and the iron bent and twisted, and suddenly there was light, gray and cold and beautiful, the light of a winter morning, the light of a world he had been hiding from for 300 years. Kael stood in the doorway, blinking against the brightness, and he saw her. Alina. She was smaller than he had imagined, wrapped in a worn wool coat that was much too thin for the mountains, her dark hair tangled and damp with melted snow, her face pale with cold and exhaustion. But her eyes were dark and bright and steady. meeting his gaze without flinching, without fear, without any of the terror that he had expected to see. As she looked at him like he was something worth finding. And Kael felt the last wall around his heart begin to crack. "A hello," Elena said. "A hello," Kael answered. And for the first time in 300 years, the Vampire King smiled. But even as the smile touched his lips, even as something like joy flickered in his ancient eyes, he felt it, the monster, stirring in the darkness, awakened by the scent of her blood and the warmth of her life and the terrible, beautiful proximity of everything he had been denying himself for centuries. Oh, the hunger was coming, and this time he wasn't sure he could stop it. Alina had found the Vampire King. She had made him open his doors. She had made him smile for the first time in 300 years. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat, a flicker of silver where the brown should have been, a shadow of something dark and hungry moving just beneath the surface. She had awakened something in him. She just didn't know yet whether it was the man or the monster.